I've learned a lot through the first half of the year. I've learned a lot about our principles. I've learned a lot about the role of principal. I've learned about legacy, strategy, complexity, and expectancy. I've also been very wrong. My name's Michael Murphy, and this is episode 11 of Vacilando. Today I speak again with Dr. Paul Kidson, and I'm most excited to tell him the 5 things that I'm very wrong about. But Paul, how you going given you've just left the midday news?
Ordinary. It's not a great deal that's joyous when you listen to the news, but it's a bit of it. When I work from home, it's a bit of my ritual. So I have some nice, what I had for lunch. Maybe this could be the next line of your saying. What are leaders eating? I had these, we've got a gourmet butcher not far from us, and I had these lamb merguez sausages on a bed of rocket with some avocado.
Okay, that's sounding delicious.
It was delicious.
But is it as good as finding out the 5 things that I've got wrong so far in this Vacilando journey? The first thing that I've got completely wrong is that there just isn't enough time in the day for the role of principalship.
Depends how you think you configure the role.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question about capacity. You're in a small school, there might be a staff of 10. There are a whole range of regulatory things that just got to get done, without which the school's not allowed to function. If you're in a school with 140 staff, you can divvy up a lot of that work. And so the type of work that you do in the time that you have becomes a little bit different. You're a teaching principal. It looks different as well. So I don't know that it's actually an homogenous statement. Like, it's going to be highly contextualized. The question is, how much time do you need? Do you have it? And are you disciplined enough to work within it? Rather than is the sheer quantum the amount that you need?
Yeah, and it's that part where I do think there are enough hours in the day for you to have a workable work-life balance and get the job done, because I'm hearing elements of those things come through with each of our principles. So if I think of the way Luke structures his week, or gets it structured for him to an extent, every minute is planned for purposefully. I'm going to get this done in this time. I'm going to work with this person for an hour so they can then go and work for 8 on the other thing. And that there's enough time in the week for that. I then think of someone, if we think of Jess's weeks are very busy because a teaching principal in a small school, these kind of, qualities, but there's a capacity there to manage it that a brand new principal who wants to prove themselves and do everything, work-life balance is clearly stretched for Jess. But it's more manageable than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, again, I think there's a nuanced understanding of that, if I can put it that way. I'll give you some wisdom from the field. One of my early mentors said to me, do the people work when the people are there, because the paper will be waiting for you when they're not. It's ideal, but he was also one of those principals who was out greeting students as they came through the front gate. He led by example, not by edicts. But he would be, these days, he would be an appalling principal, because he would be emailing people at 11:30 at night, because that's his commitment to be with the people. And so his decision is, I'll do the other stuff that doesn't need the people around me when there are no people there. Flip that around, where you have some, and again, I think this is a change that we're seeing broadly. The old school that says, and I can tell you of a couple of examples of people who make a virtue of spending time in their office. I'm going to my office to fill in this form for the Australian government. Okay, good on you. Right? That doesn't inspire me if I'm in your staff room to hear that. I would say to my assistant, I was privileged to have an admin assistant. I'm just going for a wander through the school. And she'd say, well, who are you going to see? I go, whoever I run into. Just wanted to be out and about because I knew that half hour that I had there, when I would wander around the school, unlike Luke, who might have had a purposeful meeting with that person that you identified, so they can go off and do that. My purpose, and it was deliberate and it was purposeful, was just to loiter with intent, which was the saying that I picked up from one of my mentors very early on in my principalship. Just to be there, just to be around, just to hang out. I mean, sometimes this is also the case, just turn up at the bus bay on an afternoon when kids are jumping on. I used to love when we had swimming carnivals and athletics carnivals being on the stopwatch at the end of the race. Why? Because you get to go, good on you, Michael. Fantastic. Oh, yeah, but I came last, Mr. Kidson. But you had a great swim. Good on you. That's relationship building. And that's an investment of time predicated on what I value and what I want to see valued across the community.
I used to think that there was just not enough hours in the day to be a principal. Now I think that it's about being purposeful with the minutes that you've got. However, that purpose can be as flexible as loitering with intent or as having a meaningful connection with XYZ.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to alter not only as you get more experience, but as the life and culture of the school shifts and augments, reconfigures. I created a senior executive where, like a lot of good, I'll leave it to others to whether they thought I was a good leader, but like a lot of effective leaders, perhaps I should say, I stole this idea from someone else that I saw. And it was the fact that in Westminster Cabinet, we've spoken about this before, Westminster system, everybody's got an equal voice around the executive table. Well, they weren't used to that. So we actually had to invest time to help develop the skills of being able to have that culture. And so early on, working with that team, there was a lot of deliberation. There was a lot of purposeful, targeted work done. After a little bit of time, though, that just becomes the air you breathe. And everybody wants to make a contribution, well, because that's just what we do around here. So that's what I mean. That was very time intensive to begin with, but the longer term benefits mean that the time that's available can be then spent doing other sorts of things. Great investment early on because of what it led to later on. It's always a joy talking with you, Michael.
It is. It is. Right. Number 2, thinking about crises and big events. I thought a principal had to be cool, calm, collected, and I don't think they do.
It's a challenging one. Probably similar to the first one in the sense that how you define what the crisis is going to have a big impact on the way that you respond. I might take a slight difference of opinion that it's not so much that you can't have a people don't always necessarily have to be the polished, emotionally cold, stoic type of leader in that crisis. So I'm not suggesting that. But I do think they need to have they are the emotional touchstone of what's going on in the crisis. And even if the emotional touchstone requires them to go, I'm not sure how we're going with this one just yet, I think that's okay. And maybe that's the balance, to be able to be vulnerable enough and courageous enough to say to a community, I don't quite fully have the answer for this one yet. It's like the growth mindset, isn't it? I can't do it yet. We'll find a way through this. I don't know what that is at the moment, but we'll find it. I think that's quite different than the principal in the crisis. I haven't a clue of what's going on here. I want to go home. That's not a helpful thing. I'm just going to be really blunt about that, because everybody else is already highly anxious. They're already very emotional, and they look to, and that's in some regard, that is what leadership is about. Management, you can get stuff done. But, being cool under pressure, there's an external manifestation of what that is because that's a symbolic gesture towards the community, even if internally you might be going, I really don't know what's going on. I had in my history an emergency evacuation under immediate threat of bushfire. And that is a moment to make decisions and get going. Rolling out a different learning management system as opposed to the one that you prefer, well, whatever. A police arrive to arrest a staff member, that's a critical moment, and you've got to be able to have a response to it, because you've got to assure the community that we've got things in hand. And even if that means we're working on it. Communication, crisis management is all about communication. We will let you know by this time. We had to close the school 3 times for floods. Now, the good thing about floods, mostly, not the terrifying catastrophe that happened recently in Texas, but mostly there's a lead time for a flood. We were downstream from Warragamba Dam, and so when it spills, you've got about a day before you're going to have it really impacting. But we would say, myself and the comms team would say, we will send you another email at this time. Is the school going to close? Is the school going to open? Who for? What happens? We will give you all of that at this time. And that made people go, okay, cool. Now, between when we sent that first email out and that second one, we go, what are we doing? What's going to happen? Putting all those contingency things in place. But it gives surety in the midst of the crisis.
I think that's a gift of COVID, right? The 4 p.m. press conference each day, like we knew, and I think that's become crisis vernacular now, is that
absolutely
you're going to get this email at this day, and people are used to that, and there's an assurance in that.
Yeah, and this is those 2 incidents that I was referring to took place in 2013. It was just my way of being able to say, and I think this is one of the important things for all good leaders. They make a decision because they are employed to make decisions. So put yourself in the position of being of being a parent that's going to be told that the school is closing because of flood. How do I want to hear that? When do I want to hear that? And what am I expected to do with that information? And if you can get some answers to those questions, then framing your communication up front is likely to be a little bit more effective.
My family listens to an audiobook about a lovely little school in England called Crabtree School for Girls. And there's a scene where all students are together in an assembly, and the principal she stands up, says, and then the text goes, principals don't say principals tell you off for saying
I love it.
And so I used to think you have to be cool, calm, collected as a principal. Now I think you have to think coolly, calmly, with clear principles, because we don't want robots. What we want is visible, values-driven decision-making, and we need that consistency.
Yeah, look, I think your Crabtree School for Girls reflections is pretty right. He says, the thinking, when you're in the spotlight, it's excruciating, and it's not an easy thing to come up with an answer. If you're a comedian, someone walks up to you, say something funny. Okay, well, I don't have anything right now, When you're put on the spot and you are invariably and unequivocally and without ability to get rid of it, a public figure when you're a school principal. Whether you like it or not, you are a public figure, and people have expectations upon you. The fairness and the rightness of those expectations we could talk about long and hard, but they are there. And so that's why people do expect that you will have something to say, and mostly it should be something that's coherent and meaningful and intelligent. Somebody spoke to me recently about a very, I would argue, a successful, well-regarded principal. But they said it's really frustrating. They come up with so many great ideas, and they're at the staff, and when staff go, well, how's that going to happen? They'll look at someone and go, Michael, you could look after that. Well, that doesn't engender the same sense of confidence and joy. Leave that for fill in the blanks for whoever you would like to put the face on that story for. They've got to come up with an answer, but that inability to be able to articulate how it's all going to happen is equally as important as coming up with the answer.
So the third thing that I've got wrong is that as a principal, you lose your connection with students when you no longer teach in the classroom.
Well, I question your language of lose, Michael. It changes unequivocally. We know from bucket loads of research that school leadership and the great, 7 strong claims about educational leadership that we have, a seminal piece of research in the field that I work in. School leaders have indirect influence. Teachers have very strong influence on students because they're quite close to them. But what you get to do is you have influence over levers of culture and structure and organisation that make a huge impact on students. That's predicated on you knowing who your students are, and that's predicated on being present. We've all been in situations where a school leader has made a decision and just go, what? What are they thinking? Ask any miscreant kid waiting outside the classroom because they might have done something inappropriate, and they'll tell you that it's not a good idea. Some of the best solutions to things come from the sweetest, most innocent kindergarten kids when you're a principal who spends most of their time at a secondary school. I had this wonderful kid quite on the autism spectrum, and we had this little triangular garden. We were doing a refurbishment, and none of us could think of what would go here. We're looking at the buildings and blah, blah, blah. He happened to walk past and said, Tom, what do you reckon we should put in there? Looked at me without batting an eyelid and said, kangaroo paws. Walked off. Okay, let's put some kangaroo paws in there. And we did. You got to be out amongst your people to know. And that requires, going back to your first question, time.
I see that really deliberately with our principals, all 3 of them, who are very deliberately trying to structure time in their day where they can have those connections. I think there's more to it than just the bumping into or even the structured time. Luke always says, one of my favorite things to do is having lunch with my 3-year-olds. So I presume he structures in his week to have lunch with 3-year-olds, which is a lovely thing to do. Messy, but lovely. But it's more than that. And probably the thing that the analogy that I've sort of come to grow in my mind is that one of the way your relationship as a parent changes when your kids grow up. And my kids haven't grown up, but one of my favorite parts of the conversations that you and I have had was when you told me about the relationship you've got with your son and appearing on one of his albums. And you no longer pick him up from school. You don't see him every day, but your relationship has matured, and it's not worse when you see him less. But the moment that you had with him when he contacted you to say, "Can you play here?" and those are beautiful things. Yeah. And the relationship that a principal has with their students, if the relationship matures and not just disappears, you pulled me up on the word lose. Yeah, if you lose a connection, that's a problem. If your connection matures and changes, then we're actually building something really cool.
Yeah, and there is so profound an experience of power, both, potentially badly, but hopefully positively within the role. It's one of the few roles in society that is almost still unquestioned. Now, having said that, plenty of parents will be able to disqualify that statement. But you know what I mean? Like, you're the principal of the school. You've got this gravitas, this aura, what have you. How people discharge that says an enormous amount. I'll give you 3 quick examples about particularly time. I mentioned my mentor who did the people work with the people there. He was a birthday card writer. And so he would write birthday cards and go around and, give it to the kids. I took over. I wasn't able to, for a bunch of reasons, commit to doing that. But what I did was I had a big bowl of, favourites, chocolates. And on Fridays, a little bit like Luke with his 3-year-old lunches, on Fridays, my assistant would get everybody who had a birthday during that week to come to my office, and they'd be able to choose their own chocolate out of the bowl, right? And we did that. And yes, you got a bit of an attrition as the kids got older. The kids from kindergarten through to about year 8, they loved it. You go to year 12, not so much, right? So I took the idea and found a structure that worked for me in that regard. There's an article that I saw just recently. This is one of the oldest, most kind of conservative, high-fee elite, whatever caricature you want to give of it, boys' schools. And many, many years ago, 60, 70 years ago, the headmaster at the time was sick and tired of getting these boys in trouble. And so he introduced what were called pink cards. And they were pretty, if you like, merits. You'd done some good stuff. And so again, every Friday, current headmasters of that school still goes around and hands out pink cards to everybody who's been deserving of that. 1,600 boys at that school. And that's one of the most significant ways that headmaster has a personal connection, and kids feel aggrieved if they don't get their pink card because, principal was sick or they were off, something or other. Those things are important. And the last one's a little bit indulgent. I do apologise about it. I had a school captain I'd appointed, and he's ended up becoming an ABC correspondent. He's currently working in Washington. When I first saw him appear in my television, oh my goodness, I sent him a message online. I said, "Oh, great to see you do that, blah, blah, blah." And we had a chat, and he said, "Do you remember what you'd said to me not long after I was appointed school captain? I was red carded in a sport game." I went, "No, I've got no idea." And he said, "You told me discipline, you got passion, discipline it and focus it." I went, "Oh, did I? Okay, that sounds really interesting. I'm glad I said that." Right. So for me, here's a kid who's in tears, the world's at his feet, thinks everything's going great, and then he gets sent off. He's just in an absolute hole. All I'm trying to do is just put my arm metaphorically around him and say, "It's okay, buddy. Get back up on the horse, get back in there." But for him, life-changing 6 words, 7 words. That's what I'm talking about with that power. What a principal can say to a parent, to a teacher, to a student has an inordinate amount of power, which is why it's such a privilege and why the judicious, gracious and respectful use of language is so critical.
So I used to think that your connection with students is lost when you leave the classroom. And now I think it's different. There's an immense power in principalship, and it's how you use that to build kind of mature connections and relationships with your young people that is probably the most rewarding.
There's an old saying that you don't really see the fruit of your work as a teacher or a school leader until you meet the kids at their 20-year reunion. And I think there's a lot in that. Look back on our own lives. Wow. Sorts of things that I was doing when I was 17 or 18, I shut up. And yet other people had faith in me. Other people had faith in you, and they could see things. I went to a 20-year reunion in my own school, and gosh, there were some miserable stories at that event. There were some terrific ones as well. But we, on the flip side, look at some kids, and maybe another time I'll tell you I'll tell you briefly the story, Philip. Got an ATAR of less than 15, became a fitter and turner, pulled beers through university to become a design technology teacher, ends up, long story short, as a head of department at Sydney Grammar School. Now, if I'd said to anybody when he was in year 12, that was a trajectory for Philip, I probably would have been taken away, That's the hope. That's the story that is possible. And that's why we don't say this kid's going to amount to nothing. I did say to him, he worked at a school where the deputy principal was always one of those, you're not going to amount to anything, Michael. And when he got the job at this school, I said, get the letterhead and write in handwritten paper, thanks for all your encouragement, and send it off to that said chap.
I hope he did.
I'm not sure whether he did.
So the fourth thing that I've got wrong is that it's lonely at the top.
It's lonelier. In fact, I would argue, and the research project that I'm part of would confirm that in enormous spades of research evidence, that in order to be sustainable, you must have connection and relationship. When you are making decisions about people who in a hierarchical organizational sense are your subordinates, that's not the same person to whom you can necessarily confide about how you're going. But having someone that you can, a colleague, a mentor, another principal outside of the school, somebody, we talk about the language. I just want to ring up and, just share my grief of this week. Are you happy to listen? Yep, sure, because they've had the same. So the relationships become different. And I can also say with great strength and deep, dark personal experience, your spouse or partner is not always necessarily that person because they didn't sign up for the job. And some of the things that you have to, especially if they happen to be on your staff, that's even all more complex. But you've got to be able to have people to share the journey. You can't do it on your own. Yes, it is lonelier because people will naturally, the great, kind of indicator, if I walk up to you in the staff room and say, oh, Michael, can I just have a bit of a chat? What is the culture of that school that makes people go, oh, what have I done? So there is immediate power imbalance there. So for me then to turn around and say, oh, Michael, honestly, I've been dealing with Mr. Kidson. He's just a complete nutter. That's the wrong relationship to be having that conversation with. Do you know what I mean? You've got to be able to have a safe conversation space to be able to say, I've got this parent just who is intractably difficult. They refuse to engage with me, whatever. Or, I got this abusive letter, tore me to shreds. I sat down and I thought, why am I even doing? You've got to be able to process and unpack that with somebody. But it invariably is not best served to be your spouse. Because as I say, they haven't signed up for this necessarily in the same way. But it's got to be somebody.
So there's probably a semantic argument here for the right word, but there's something like loneliness, isolation. There's something there. Because
look, you're right. It's a lonelier job than when you are not the principal, but it doesn't need to be a lonely job. Maybe that's the distinction.
It's this weird one where you're more connected to people than you've ever been because you've got more relationships. You've got more oversight of more people. Your staff, students, parents. Absolutely, everyone knows who you are, but there's something that causes that gap, or there's some gap that you do need to fill, and that's probably something that maybe I've learned over the course of this semester or of the first half of this year is it's thinking about how people fill that gap, and some people are doing that with mentorship. Some people are doing that with quite a deliberate structure at their school. I don't know, but there's some sort of gap there that's something like loneliness or being lonelier, something about being more isolated or it's isolation, but there's something.
Yeah, you're right. Look, a couple of months back, was before the federal election, I got on the metro, and sitting opposite me was a member of parliament, quite well-known member of parliament, and they were just preparing to go into the city to do something or other. They didn't talk to anybody. They were just doing their bit. But I know them, but they've got no idea who I am, because I've seen them on the TV and blah, blah. Later that night, I see them on TV when so did I actually? No, I wasn't connected with that person at all. We just happened to be on the same train. Right? So if they're going to have some debriefing about their day, they're likely to do it with another person who's similarly been an MP and had a similar sort of day in a different electorate. And I think that's a nice metaphor. You're not the MPs of the same group of people, but you come together and you share a connection through your similar experiences, and you're able to both sympathise, empathise, support, mentor, coach, whatever it is. Early career principals, I would say, to a fault, should deliberately seek out mentors, actively seek them out. When I went and met with one of them, I asked the principal, I was the deputy at the time, I want to go and meet with this person. And they didn't like that person particularly. And they said, why is that? And I said, because they're different to you. I'm going to get something different from them than I get from you. And similarly, as a principal, I kept a variety of diverse voices that I wanted to hear from and who I wanted them to challenge me, because that's the way that you build a community of principal leadership. I can't do that with my head of English. I can't do that with the Year 9 coordinator, because there is a structural power imbalance there.
Are you a cricket fan at all?
It depends. Yes, I can be. What would you like me to say?
Do you know of Simon Towfel? Does that name resonate?
In the back of my mind.
Ah.
Once you start telling me, it might hit in a bit more.
He was sort of cricket umpire of the year for many years. An Australian guy, absolute immaculate umpire, sort of 99.9% correct decision making. I spoke to him years ago, and he talked about a couple of things. The one of the ways that he used to structure his reflection was every decision that he made that he wanted feedback on, he got out a book and he wrote it down. And the second thing was that he never spoke to someone involved in the match for feedback.
Interesting.
The worst person to give me feedback on how I've done is someone who was emotionally involved in it.
Yeah.
And, your head of English may not be the right person to give you feedback or connection. But we need someone from a different school, and he would get umpires from all these different things, but he would never get advice from someone within the game.
Yeah.
And someone would say, oh, but what if someone said you did a good job? He said, I probably didn't then.
Nice. Yeah, I'll take that. It reminds me of a privileged professional learning experience I had. We did mutual shadowing. So another principal, exactly the way that you described, or similar to the way you described, I went and followed them round for a day. We didn't talk about anything during the day. I was just an invisible, it's all done with permission of the school and the people that were involved. So if there was an interview that they needed to have with a parent, for example, they would say, Paul's here, he's just here to observe me and give me some feedback. If that felt uncomfortable, I didn't go in, obviously. And then that same person came and spent a day in my school following me around. And then we debriefed with one another about what we saw. It was one of the most powerful experiences, and we to this day remain terrific friends. And again, the sorts of conversations that we could have, you go to these once-a-term meetings. I'd seek him out because we then had that common story that we'd been through, that common journey that we'd been through together, and he could pick up, oh, how are you going on that such and such that we, it was wonderful to do that. So that's not being lonely, but it's certainly not within the school. And I think you're right. It's a different different word. You've challenged me to start thinking about what the word is. But within the school, there is certainly a great deal of change to the nature of your social life.
So I used to think it was lonely at the top. Now I want to choose a different word, but it's something maybe lonely and we've got to do something about it to bridge that or to fill that space, and that space is probably not going to be filled from people within.
Agreed.
So the last thing that I think I've learnt, or that I used to think, is that you should build a legacy in your time as a principal.
I'm interested to know what it is that you think you've learned now. I loved listening to Luke's reflection about legacy, but partly because I think it's on the way to the understanding that I have about it. Legacy is actually not made by the principal. Legacy is made by what everybody else thinks about the principal.
All right, so I'll go back to my notes. I used to think that you need to build your legacy in your time as a principal. Now I think you're there to cultivate a community that builds its own. And a true legacy isn't a plaque with your name on it. It's what people think about you and the culture that outlasts you.
Yeah, absolutely. It lies within the purvey of others to make. Let's go back to your cricket umpire. His statistics might be really significant, 99%, whatever it was that you said. Is that his legacy? Well, I would contend partly, but I'd also suggest that what he shared to you, that he seeks feedback from people that are going to help him, his legacy is what you told me, not what he said.
And this is the thing with principalship, and I'm so with you on that, because so often a principal, and we've heard it with ours, I've come in and I've set a strategic intent. My first thing is to get the strategic plan going. And there's always, I need to get to know my community first, all that kind of stuff. But we seem to think that putting a strategic plan in place is the job of a principal. And that once you've done that, you've like put your mark on a place. And I just don't think that's true.
No, there are some who are gifted, pots of gold, and they build buildings and, various bits and pieces. Happy days. There are some people who introduce, I was at a school that offered the International Baccalaureate. Right? So the principal who introduced the International Baccalaureate, that's part of his legacy, right? But his introduction isn't the legacy. His legacy is that it's continuing 25 years later, right? And we introduced, so he'd been the principal at the school during the 90s, and we did a lot of work, my team and I, around rebuilding house-based culture, right? Call it Harry Potter if you like, but it works because people have a connection to an entity, right? And so we had this inter-house competition of, debating and public speaking and a few cultural activities, and of course, your classic, swimming and athletics and a few other things that we threw in there as well. And when we sat down, we said, we need something that galvanizes this. And so we got this cup and we named it in his honor. 20 years later, from when he'd left the school, no one had any idea who his name was. And that's the reason why we chose that name, because it continues to say he's been the principal of the school. He's made an important contribution to it. And we do this. I was a teacher at a very big old school again, and for the year 7 kids, because it's predominantly a secondary school at that point, they would come to the school, and again, a long history, 130 plus years. The first thing that you did for the first 3 lessons of year 7 history is you walked around the grounds of the school. These gates that are at the front of the driveway, who are they named in honor of? What is this building named after? You know, blah, 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 just to get the geography of the place and understand all of that. So when we say, oh, we're going off to such and such hall, the kids eventually go, oh, right, okay. And that becomes enculturated part of the history, right? All of those things are determined by those who come after it. What do they say? History is written by the winners. You know, it's those who have come after those that are doing the work that get to make it. I've got plenty of people who would be able to say horrid things about what they think my legacy is. I've got other people who think I've done some reasonably okay things. What I think about it's not important. They are the ones who are the judges of that. And that's why it's, again, a fraught privilege to be a school principal. You give everything, you leave it out there on the field, you perform as if you are there trying to get an Academy Award, and in the end, it's other people who make a determination about its efficacy.
Thank you to Dr. Paul Kidson. My name is Michael Murphy, and this has been episode 11 of Vacilando.
You've learned a lot, my friend.
I think so. What have you learnt?
I've learned that there is great hope